Today's story is all about a little girl called Drusilla, and it's called Drusilla and Her Brothers by Dyan Sheldon. Drusilla and Her Brothers. Drusilla was a quiet, thoughtful little girl. She had a small toy hippopotamus and 4 big brothers. Drusilla's brothers were Harlan, Cal, CJ and Joe. The hippopotamus's name was Mrs. Moo. Mrs. Moo went everywhere with Drusilla. Harlan, Cal, CJ and Joe went nowhere with her. "You're too little to hang out with us," declared Harlan. Cal nodded. "You only get in the way." "You're a baby," said CJ. "I'm not a baby," argued Drusilla. "I'm just short." "A short baby," said Joe. Drusilla's brothers wouldn't let her join in their games. They left her at home when they went off on their bikes. They wouldn't even take her to the park with them so she could fly her kite while they played football. There was only one thing Drusilla's brothers liked to do with her, and that was tease her. They moved her things around, they filled her pockets with stones, they stuffed her backpack with empty packets. They nicked chips from her plate when she wasn't looking. They were always thinking of new and better ways to annoy her. But being a quiet, thoughtful little girl, Drusilla wasn't very easy to upset. No matter what her brothers did, she never cried or shouted or threw a tantrum as other little girls might have done. Drusilla had learned to ignore them. Mrs. Moo, of course, was calm itself. "This is boring," said Cal. "Too right," said CJ. "It's no fun teasing someone who never gets annoyed," said Joe. "There has to be something we can do to annoy her," said Harlan. One morning, Drusilla was getting dressed when she discovered that her new pink shoes weren't where she'd left them the night before. "My brothers must be playing one of their tricks," she told Mrs. Moo. She could hear the boys whispering out on the landing. As always, Mrs. Moo simply smiled. "You're right," said Drusilla. "It's not the end of the world." And she went off to her wardrobe and got out her old trainers instead. "She's not meant to do that," Cal complained. "She's meant to go mad," grumbled CJ. "Or cry," added Joe. "We'll have to try something else," said Harlan. That afternoon, Drusilla and Mrs. Moo were sitting in the garden reading a book. They had just reached the best bit when the sprinkler suddenly burst into action, soaking them both. Drusilla and Mrs. Moo jumped out of their deck chair. Drusilla could hear her brothers laughing by the back of the house. "It's them again," she whispered to Mrs. Moo. Mrs. Moo just smiled. "You're right," said Drusilla. "It's only water." And she moved the chair to where the sprinkler couldn't reach it. She and Mrs. Moo would dry in no time in the sun. "Why isn't she upset?" Joe whined. "Yeah, why can't she act like everybody else's little sisters?" moaned Cal and CJ. "There has to be something that will bother her," said Harlan. "We'll just have to work out what it is." That night, Drusilla was taking a bath, and Mrs. Moo was floating beside her in an inflatable soap dish when the light went out. "That'll be the boys again," sighed Drusilla. She could hear her brothers shuffling restlessly outside the bathroom door. But even in the dark, Drusilla could see Mrs. Moo's smile. "You were right," said Drusilla. "One should always be prepared." And she took her torch from from the shelf behind her and switched it on. "Why isn't she scared?" hissed Joe. "She really is too much," muttered CJ. "She's no fun at all," said Cal. But Harlan, who was the eldest and the cleverest, said, "Don't worry, this time I've got a brilliant idea." The next morning, Drusilla woke up with a start. Mrs. Moo wasn't lying beside her as usual. She looked under the duvet, the pillows and the bed, but Mrs. Moo was nowhere to be seen. This was the worst trick her brothers had ever played. But Drusilla managed not to scream or cry. She marched across the landing to their bedroom. Her brothers were all still in their pyjamas. Harlan smiled down from the top bunk. "What do you want?" "I want Mrs. Moo," said Drusilla. Cal smiled up from the bunk under Harlan's. "So what?" "You lot took her, that's what." Drusilla held out her hand. "Now give her back." "We don't have your stupid hippo," laughed CJ. Joe fiddled with his shoelace. "Yeah, we wouldn't want that. It's a baby toy." Their mother appeared in the doorway. "What's going on in here?" Drusilla pointed at her brothers. "They've taken Mrs. Moo." Their mother frowned. "Oh, boys." "It's not true," protested Cal. "We haven't touched her." CJ looked hurt. "Cross my heart, Mum." Joe was still fiddling with his shoelace. "Drusilla's probably left her somewhere," he mumbled. "She'll turn up." "You can search our room if you want," offered Harlan. "We have nothing to hide." Drusilla and her mother searched the boys' bedroom. But although they found a ball of garden twine in one of the desks and a heap of Lego pieces under a bed, there was no sign of Mrs. Moo. "It looks like your brothers are telling the truth this time." Drusilla's mother put the ball of twine in her pocket to return to the garden shed. "You must have left her somewhere and forgotten." "But I had her last night when I fell asleep," insisted Drusilla. Their mother turned to the boys with a sigh. "If I find out that you have taken Mrs. Moo, there'll be no more football in the park for the rest of the year. Do you understand?" Cal, CJ and Joe nodded. "Don't worry," said Harlan. "You won't." After breakfast, Drusilla looked in the places where her brothers usually hid her things. "Mrs. Moo!" she called as she hunted in the living room. "Mrs. Moo, where are you?" She emerged from the fireplace, covered in soot. Harlan looked up from the book he was reading by the window. "Gosh," he said, "I wonder where she could be." "Mrs. Moo!" called Drusilla as she rummaged through the kitchen. "Where are you, Mrs. Moo?" She had to shake the ice off her fingers when she'd finished searching the freezer. Cal was putting away some carrier bags. "It's too bad you can't remember where you left her." He shook his head sadly. "At this rate, you might never find her." "Mrs. Moo!" Drusilla shouted as she poked around the bathroom. "Mrs. Moo, where are you?" She found her new pink shoes in the linen cupboard, but no small hippopotamus. "Still no luck?" CJ threw a wet towel into the laundry basket. "Oh dear, I hope she's not gone for good." Drusilla stumped across the lawn, calling, "Mrs. Moo! Mrs. Moo!" When she came out of the shed, she was covered in cobwebs, but there was no smiling hippo in her hands. Joe was sitting by the pond. "Are you going to start crying now?" he asked. Drusilla went up to her room straight after supper. Harlan, Cal, CJ and Joe followed her up the stairs, calling, "Mrs. Moo! Mrs. Moo! Oh, where can you be?" "You'd better give her back," warned Drusilla. Harlan shrugged. "But we don't have her." Cal nodded. "That's right. You've looked everywhere," said CJ. "She isn't here." "She has to be," insisted Drusilla stubbornly. Not like you'll ever find her, muttered Joe. Don't be so sure of that, said Drusilla. When Drusilla got into bed that night, she kept her light on for a while. She was thinking. Her brothers hadn't gone anywhere all day, so Mrs. Moo had to be somewhere around the house. But where? She took the photograph of her and Mrs. Moo from the bedside table. I wish you could tell me where you are, Mrs. Moo, Drusilla whispered. Mrs. Moo smiled back at her the way she always did. You're right, said Drusilla. I'm not thinking hard enough. Her brothers must have left some clues, something she hadn't noticed at the time. She closed her eyes and went back over the day in her mind. She saw herself in her brother's room. Harlan, Cal and CJ were all smiling. There was nothing unusual about that. Joe was fiddling with his shoelace. Drusilla opened her eyes. Shoes! Her brothers were in their pyjamas, but they were wearing shoes. They must have been outside. But I looked in the garden, she sighed. Mrs. Moo continued to smile from the photograph. Think, 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 she seemed to say. Drusilla thought. She pictured her brother's room. She saw the usual pile of clothes and games. She saw the ball of twine in Cal's desk and the Lego pieces under the bed. What was Cal doing with garden string? Where was the large plastic jar that the boys kept their Lego in? She opened her eyes again. It just doesn't make any sense, Drusilla informed the photo of her and Mrs. Moo. They can't have posted you somewhere. They never went out. Mrs. Moo smiled. Think, think, think. Shoes, twine, missing jar. Drusilla squeezed her eyes tight, very shut. She saw Harlan sitting by the garden window, Cal with carrier bags in the kitchen, CJ putting a wet towel in the basket, Joe sitting by the pond. That's it, cried Drusilla. She kissed the photo, snuggled under the covers and went to sleep. The next morning, Drusilla was up very early. She went straight to the pond. Pinned under a large rock, she found the end of a long piece of green twine that dangled into the water. She tugged slowly at the twine. Centimetre by centimetre, the large plastic jar her brothers used for their Lego rose from the pond. Drusilla opened the jar and pulled out the carrier bags stuffed inside. From out of the bags, she took a small hippo. Mrs. Moo was a bit damp, but she was still smiling. Drusilla hugged her tight. Oh, Mrs. Moo, I'm so glad to see you. Mrs. Moo was glad to see her too. After breakfast, Harlan, Cal, CJ and Joe all got ready to go to the park. But when they came downstairs with their football, Drusilla was waiting by the door for them with her kite. Where do you think you're going? Asked Harlan. Drusilla turned so they could see the small hippopotamus peeking out of her backpack. With you. You're going to help me and Mrs. Moo fly our kite. The boys all laughed. Why would we do that? Asked Harlan. Drusilla opened her mouth, but before she could answer, their mother came down the hall. You found Mrs. Moo, she cried. Where was she? Drusilla looked at Harlan. Harlan looked at his brothers, and then he grabbed Drusilla's hand. We don't have time, Mum, now. We're taking Drusilla to the park with us to fly her kite. Why, isn't that nice, said their mother. You have fun. Oh, we will, said Drusilla, and she and Mrs. Moo smiled. The end.